He pulled a stranger from a burning car 3 years ago, and that stranger never knew his name. Now that stranger is his best friend. The only man he trusts, the only man he loves, and the one man who can never find out the truth. Every night Ronan Wells falls asleep believing fate saved him. Every night August Cade lies awake knowing it wasn't fate at all. One secret, one impossible choice, one friendship built on a lie so tender it feels like love, and so dangerous it could end everything. Ronan swore he'd never love again after the fire took the man he was supposed to marry. He never expected his best friend would be the one to make him break that promise, or that the truth about that night would arrive exactly when their hearts were finally ready to open. But what happened next changed my life forever. Thorn Bay Harbor was the kind of town where the fog arrived before the fishing boats and left long after they'd gone, curling low over the water like it was trying to keep a secret of its own. Ronan Wells had lived there for 3 years, in a narrow house at the top of Candle Street with green shutters and a piano workshop built into what used to be a boathouse. He restored pianos for a living, old, forgotten instruments that people brought him wrapped in blankets and apologies, certain nothing could be done. Ronan always proved them wrong. He had a gift for finding the note still alive inside something everyone else had given up on. He never talked about why that mattered so much to him, and no one in Thorn Bay Harbor asked, because everyone in a small town eventually learns which doors are better left closed. He was 29 years old, and he had not said the words "I love you" to another living person in 3 years. Not since Callum. Callum Ashworth had been the architect of Ronan's whole future. The wedding they'd planned for a spring that never came, the house by the cliffs they'd already put a deposit on. The life mapped out so completely that Ronan sometimes still caught himself designing around a person who wasn't there anymore. The car had gone off Route 9 during a February storm, the guardrail giving way like it had been waiting for an excuse, and by the time anyone reached the wreckage, Callum was already gone. Ronan had been in the passenger seat. He had lived. He had never fully forgiven himself for that unbalanced arithmetic. August Cade, Gus, to anyone who mattered, had moved to Thorn Bay Harbor 18 months later with a camera bag, a second-hand truck, and a grief of his own he kept folded so small most people never noticed its shape. He was 31, a photographer who shot weddings on weekends in moody, empty landscapes the rest of the time, as if he were more interested in what a place looked like once everyone had left it. He had warm brown eyes that made strangers trust him too quickly, a laugh that filled a room before he meant it to, and a way of looking at Ronan, really looking the way you look at a photograph you're trying to memorize, that Ronan had noticed and never once let himself name. They met on a Tuesday in the hardware store, arguing pleasantly over the last box of brass piano wire, which Gus had picked up for no reason except that he liked the way it caught the light. "You don't even own a piano," Ronan had said. "No," Gus had answered, "but I might want to marry someone who does." It was a joke. It landed like something else entirely. 2 years later, they were still circling each other, best friends in every visible way, and something far more fragile underneath that neither of them dared to disturb. Gus knew a truth Ronan didn't. He had known it since the night of the storm, 3 years before they'd ever properly met, because it had been Gus, driving home from a job in the next county, who had come around the bend on Route 9 and found the wreck first. It had been Gus who'd broken the passenger door with a tire iron and pulled the unconscious man out of the smoke before the fire took hold, laying him on the wet asphalt and pressing his coat to a head wound while he waited, alone, for the ambulance. Gus had never gotten close enough to see the driver breathing. He had never learned the survivor's name, because the paramedics arrived and pulled him back and told him there was nothing more he could do. And by the time he thought to ask, the ambulance was already gone. He had spent that whole winter checking the newspaper for an obituary, terrified he'd find one and terrified he wouldn't, never once imagining that a year and a half later he would walk into a hardware store in a town he'd chosen at random, and fall for the very man whose life he had saved without ever learning his face. He recognized Ronan the second time he saw him properly, in daylight, the scar above his left eyebrow catching the afternoon sun the exact way scars from car glass do. Gus had gone home that night and sat on the floor of his new apartment for an hour, holding a photograph he'd taken of Ronan without meaning to, laughing at something mid-sentence, utterly unaware, and understood with a kind of quiet devastation that he was already in love with a stranger he had once held together with his bare hands. He also understood, with the same clarity, that if he told Ronan the truth, he would lose the only real friendship he had left in the world. So he said nothing. He told himself it was kindness. He told himself it was timing. He told himself 100 small lies to protect one enormous one. And every day that passed made the truth heavier and the silence easier, until 2 years had gone by and the secret had grown roots. Their friendship, meanwhile, had become the architecture of both their lives. Ronan taught Gus to hear the difference between a piano that was merely in tune and one that was actually alive. Gus taught Ronan to notice light, how it fell differently through fog than through rain, how a room could look entirely new depending on where you stood in it. They ate dinner together most nights, usually at Ronan's, the two of them cross-legged on the workshop floor surrounded by disassembled keys and half-repaired hammers, arguing about music or nothing at all. They had, without ever discussing it, become each other's emergency contact, each other's Sunday plans, each other's person to call at 2 in the morning. Everyone in Thornbay Harbor assumed they were together already. Neither of them corrected the assumption, and neither of them acted on it, because Ronan had built a wall around his heart with Callum's name carved into every stone, and Gus had built his own wall out of guilt, and somehow the two walls had ended up facing each other instead of coming down. It was Gus who noticed first that something had shifted, on an ordinary Thursday in early autumn, watching Ronan work on an old upright piano that had arrived that morning missing half its felt hammers, its owner convinced it was beyond saving. Ronan had his sleeves pushed up, sawdust in his dark hair, utterly absorbed, and Gus realized he had stopped pretending to read his book 10 minutes ago and was simply watching the way Ronan's hands moved, careful, deliberate, almost reverent, and thinking that he wanted to spend the rest of his life exactly like this, in this room, watching this man bring something back from the edge of being unfixable. "You're staring," Ronan said, without looking up. "I'm supervising," Gus said. "Someone has to make sure you don't marry the piano." Ronan huffed something close to a laugh, the sound rare enough that Gus collected it like currency. "You'd be a terrible best man. I'd be an excellent best man. I have a whole speech planned. It's mostly about how you talk to inanimate objects more tenderly than you talk to people. I talk to you tenderly." The words left Ronan's mouth before he'd fully weighed them, and the workshop went very quiet, the only sound the wind pushing fog against the windows. Gus set his book down. "Do you," he said, not a question exactly, more like an invitation to keep going. Ronan finally looked up, and for a moment neither of them moved, the air between them thick with 2 years of things unsaid, and Ronan felt something in his chest crack open half an inch, terrifying and warm at once, before he did what he always did and turned back to the piano, hiding behind the safety of an unfinished task. Gus let him. He always let him. He told himself it was patience. Some nights he wondered if it was cowardice wearing patience as a disguise. The obstacle arrived 3 weeks later in the shape of a letter, an invitation to a memorial gathering marking 3 years since the accident, organized by Callum's old university friends, who still, out of love and habit, tried to keep Ronan tethered to a life he'd mostly stopped living. Ronan read it standing in his own doorway, and something in his face closed like a door slamming in another room. He didn't mention it to Gus for 2 days, which was itself unusual enough that Gus knew something was wrong before he knew what. When Ronan finally told him, sitting on the workshop floor with the letter folded into a small, tight square in his hands, his voice had the flat, careful tone of a man walking across ice he didn't trust. "I don't know if I can go," Ronan admitted. "Every year they invite me. Every year I almost go. And then I remember I was in the car. I remember I lived and he didn't, and I don't know how to sit in a room with people who loved him and explain that I still don't understand why." Gus wanted, more than anything, to tell him the truth in that moment. That he had been there, that his hands had been the last hands to touch Ronan before the world went dark and sirens took over. That he had spent 3 years wondering about the stranger he'd pulled from a wreck and had somehow found him again without ever meaning to. The words rose in his throat and he swallowed them, telling himself Ronan didn't need one more piece of grief thrown into a night already full of it. He told himself, again, that silence was mercy. He was starting to suspect, underneath that silence was simply fear. "You don't have to explain anything to anyone," Gus said instead, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. "Surviving isn't a debt you owe an explanation for. Sometimes it feels like one. Then let me come with you. You don't have to carry it by yourself." Ronan looked at him for a long moment, something unguarded moving across his face. "Why do you do this?" He asked quietly. Show up for all my worst nights like it costs you nothing? Because it doesn't feel like a cost, Gus said, and meant it more than Ronan could have known. It feels like the only thing I actually want to be doing. The memorial was held in a stone chapel outside town. Candlelight against old windows, a room full of people who had loved Callum Ashworth in 100 different ordinary ways. His university roommate, his old rowing coach, a cousin who cried through the entire first hymn. Ronan stood at the back beside Gus, his hand finding Gus's sleeve without seeming to notice he'd done it, and when Callum's roommate stood to speak and mentioned, almost in passing, the stranger who had pulled Callum's fiancée from the wreck before the ambulance arrived. A detail from the old police report that had never been fully explained. Ronan went very still. They never found out who it was, the roommate said. Some passerby. Gone before anyone got his name. I've always wondered about him. Whoever he was, he gave us 3 more years of Ronan. Ronan turned to look at Gus without thinking. Some instinct in him reaching for the person he trusted most in that room to share the strange, aching detail with, and found Gus staring straight ahead, jaw tight, a stillness in his whole body that didn't match the moment. It was such a small thing. A held breath a half-second too long. A man who processed everything through a camera lens suddenly refusing to look at anything at all. But Ronan had spent 2 years learning the specific grammar of August Cade's silences, and this one didn't read as grief. It read as guilt. He didn't say anything that night. He carried the question home instead, turning it over for days, watching Gus with a new and unbearable attentiveness. The way Gus flinched slightly whenever Route 9 came up in conversation. The way he always changed the subject when storms were mentioned. The tire iron Ronan had once found in the bed of Gus's truck and never thought twice about until now. Small pieces that had always been there, suddenly rearranging themselves into a shape Ronan didn't want to see and couldn't stop seeing. He confronted him on a night when the fog had rolled in thick enough to swallow the streetlights, standing in the doorway of the workshop with his arms crossed like he was bracing for cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was you, Ronan said. Not a question. On Route 9. The stranger who pulled me out. Gus didn't answer right away, and the silence answered for him. Say it, Ronan said, his voice cracking down the middle. Please, just say it so I know I'm not losing my mind. It was me, Gus said finally, and something in him seemed to fold inward as he said it, 2 years of careful architecture collapsing all at once. I was driving home. I saw the wreck. I got you out before the fire reached the cab. I didn't know your name. I didn't know anything about you. I just knew I couldn't leave you in there. His voice caught. And then 18 months later I moved to a town I picked because I liked a photograph I'd seen of the harbor, and I walked into a hardware store and there you were. Alive. A whole person with a whole life, and I recognized the scar over your eyebrow before I recognized anything else about you, and I didn't know how to tell you without it changing everything between us. You've known this whole time. Ronan's voice was very quiet now, which was somehow worse than shouting. 2 years. Every dinner. Every night I fell apart in front of you about losing him. You knew you were the one who, he couldn't finish the sentence. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was terrified, Gus said, and it came out raw, stripped of every careful edit he'd made to this confession in his head 1,000 times. Terrified you'd look at me and only see the accident. Terrified you'd hate me for being the reason you survived and he didn't, like somehow I chose wrong that night. Terrified that the second you knew, I'd stop being your friend and start being a reminder of the worst night of your life. I didn't want to be your grief, Ronan. I wanted, he stopped himself. What did you want? Gus looked at him then. Finally, fully, everything he'd hidden for 2 years right there on his face. I wanted to be the thing that came after it. Not the accident. What came next. But I was a coward, and I let a lie get comfortable, and I am so sorry because you deserved the truth a long time before tonight. Ronan stood there in the fog-thick dark, feeling something enormous move through his chest. Grief and fury and gratitude all trying to occupy the same small space at once. You saved my life, he finally said, and then you spent 2 years afraid to tell me, because you thought I'd punish you for it. Wouldn't you have been within your rights to? No, Ronan said, and the word broke something open in both of them. God, no, Gus. Do you understand what you're telling me? You didn't just survive that night alongside me from a distance. You're the reason I got a second half of my life at all. Every year I've had since then, Every piano I've fixed, every stupid argument we've had about brass wire, every dinner on this floor, all of it exists because of what you did in about 90 seconds on the worst night either of us has ever lived through. His voice shook. I'm not angry that you saved me. I'm terrified of how close I came to never knowing the man who did. I should have told you sooner. Yes, Ronan agreed. You should have. And I understand exactly why you didn't, because I've spent 3 years so afraid of loving anyone again that I built an entire life designed to avoid it. And you've been standing in the middle of that life the whole time, and I let myself believe it was just friendship because friendship was safer than admitting what it actually was. The fog pressed close around the workshop, muffling the whole world down to the small circle of light spilling from the doorway, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to hide behind. Gus took a step closer. What was it actually? He asked. Quiet, uncertain, more afraid in that moment than he'd been pulling a stranger from a burning car. It was you, Ronan said simply. It's been you for a long time. I just didn't have anywhere to put it, because I promised myself I'd never do this again. Never let myself need someone the way I needed him. And then you showed up, patient and steady and endlessly kind, and I broke that promise about 100 times without ever admitting it out loud. You're allowed to love again, Ronan. I know that now, Ronan said, and something in his face finally softened all the way, 3 years of careful distance dissolving at once. I think some part of me has known it since the hardware store. I just needed the truth to catch up to the feeling. He closed the last of the distance between them, slow enough that Gus had every chance to step back and didn't, and when their foreheads met in the doorway of that small boathouse workshop, surrounded by half-repaired pianos and brass wire and 2 years of careful silence finally spoken aloud, it didn't feel like betrayal or grief or guilt. It felt, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, like relief. I'm still sorry, Gus whispered. For the lie. For how long I let it sit there. I know, Ronan said. And I forgive you. Not because it didn't matter. Because it does, and I'm choosing you anyway. Winter came to Thornbay Harbor slower that year, or maybe it simply felt that way, because for the first time since the storm on Route 9, Ronan wasn't dreading the cold. He and Gus told no one the full story of that first meeting on the highway. Some truths belonged only to the two of them, but everyone in town noticed the change anyway. The easy way Gus's hand found the small of Ronan's back in the hardware store, the way Ronan started teaching him, properly this time, how to play the piano he still didn't own, on evenings that stretched long past dinner. The workshop stayed full of instruments other people had given up on, and Ronan kept bringing them back to life, one hammer and one string at a time, understanding now in a way he hadn't before that some things aren't broken beyond repair. They're only waiting for the right person to sit with them long enough to find the notes still living underneath the silence. He'd sworn he would never love again. He'd meant it. The night he made that promise, kneeling on wet asphalt in the wreckage of everything he'd planned his life around. But love, it turned out, doesn't ask permission before it arrives. It simply waits, patient as fog over a harbor, for the moment a heart is finally ready to let it in. And on an ordinary Thursday, in a boathouse full of half-finished pianos, with fog pressing soft against the windows and a man beside him who had once held him together with his bare hands, Ronan Wells discovered that falling for his best friend hadn't broken his promise at all. It had simply been the truest way he'd ever kept it, the promise, underneath the fear, to let himself be loved again when the right person finally came looking. Spring arrived in Thornbay Harbor the way it always did, reluctantly, the fog thinning by degrees until the harbor mouth was visible again from the top of Candle Street. Ronan had gotten used to a version of his life he hadn't let himself imagine in 3 years. Gus's boots by the door, Gus's coffee mug left permanently on the workshop windowsill, the particular quiet of falling asleep beside someone and trusting the morning would still be good. He had stopped flinching at the sound of Route 9 mentioned in passing. He had, for the first time since February of that long-ago storm, begun sketching plans for the workshop he'd always dreamed of. Not the boathouse he rented, but a real one, built into the cliffside north of town, glass-walled and full of light, where broken instruments could come to be remembered instead of replaced. He hadn't told Gus about the sketches yet. He was waiting for the right evening, the right kind of quiet, to say out loud that he was finally imagining a future again. Gus, meanwhile, had spent the winter photographing the harbor in every kind of weather, chasing a project he'd never quite named even to himself. Empty piers at low tide, frost on the fishing boats, the particular blue of Thornbay Harbor mornings before anyone else was awake. He didn't know that a portfolio he'd submitted almost as an afterthought to a magazine in Reykjavik, months earlier, before any of this, had quietly made its way to an editor who couldn't stop looking at it. The call came on a Tuesday, while Gus was standing in Ronan's workshop watching him wrestling an old Steinway, and by the time he hung up his hands weren't quite steady. "They want me to spend a year photographing the fishing villages along the Icelandic coast," Gus said, staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. "A real book. My name on it. It's the kind of opportunity one used to lie awake wanting so badly it hurt." Ronan set down the tuning wrench slowly, something cold moving through his chest that he recognized immediately and hated recognizing. "A year," he repeated. "A year," Gus confirmed. "Starting in 6 weeks." The word sat between them in the workshop like a held breath. Ronan had known, in some careful, unexamined corner of himself, that a day like this might come, that Gus's talent had always been bigger than a small harbor town, that the empty landscapes he photographed were really just rehearsals for a bigger kind of leaving. He thought he'd made peace with loving someone whose gift required distance. He discovered, standing there with wire dust on his hands, that he hadn't made peace with anything at all. He had only postponed the fear. "You should take it," Ronan said, too quickly, the words arriving before he'd decided whether he meant them. "You don't sound like you mean that." "I mean it," Ronan said, and immediately proved he didn't by turning back to the piano, hiding behind an unfinished task the way he always did when the truth was too large to look at directly. Gus watched him do it, recognizing the old defense mechanism instantly, because he'd fallen in love with a man who processed his hardest feelings through his hands instead of his voice, and 2 years of friendship had taught him exactly what that particular silence meant. "Ronan, look at me. I'm looking at the piano. You're hiding behind the piano. There's a difference." Gus crossed the room and gently, carefully, took the wrench out of Ronan's hands, setting it aside so there was nothing left to hold on to except each other. "Talk to me. Actually talk to me. I told you the truth about Route 9 because I promised myself I'd never let something this important sit unspoken between us again. So don't do it to me now." Ronan exhaled, and something in him cracked open. 3 months of careful new happiness suddenly revealing the fault line still running underneath it. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "Not of you leaving. I know that's not what this is. I'm terrified of what happens to me if you go and something happens. A storm. A road. A moment I'm not there for. I already know exactly how fast an ordinary day can turn into the worst night of someone's life. Gus. I've lived it. And I don't know how to love you and also let you get on a plane to the other side of the world for a year without feeling like I'm standing at the edge of that same wreck again. Just waiting." Gus's expression softened into something aching and understanding. "That's not fair to either of us," he said gently. "Not because you're wrong to be afraid. Because I love someone who survived the worst night of his life, and I will not become another reason you're afraid to keep living yours. If I stay because you're scared, we'll both spend the year resenting a decision neither of us actually chose. That's not love. That's just grief wearing a new disguise. Then what do I do with the fear?" "You let me help you carry it," Gus said. "The same way you let me carry mine. That night in the fog, when I finally told you the truth I'd been hiding for 2 years. You don't have to solve it alone. You just have to let me in far enough to try." They didn't resolve it that night or the next. The 6 weeks that followed were some of the hardest of the whole relationship. Quieter arguments than the one before, born less of anger than of two people trying to love each other through a fear neither of them had fully named. Ronan found himself, on more than one evening, standing at the cliffside site he'd chosen for his dream workshop, staring out at the water where the horizon disappeared into fog, wondering whether wanting someone to stay was protection or possession, whether the line between the two was as clear as he'd always assumed. It was Gus who found the answer first in an unlikely place, an old photograph he'd taken the week they met, of Ronan laughing over the box of brass piano wire in the hardware store, unaware he was being photographed at all. Gus had kept it for 2 years without fully understanding why, and looking at it now, packing for a trip that suddenly felt like it might cost him everything, he understood. He wasn't running toward Iceland to escape anything. He was running toward the same instinct that had made him stop the truck on Route 9 3 years earlier, the belief that some things were worth reaching for even when reaching meant risk. He wanted Ronan to understand that instinct wasn't the enemy of love. It was the reason he'd ever found Ronan at all. He brought the photograph to the workshop the night before he was supposed to leave, the boathouse smelling of varnish and salt air, fog pressing soft against the windows exactly the way it had the night the truth about Route 9 finally came out. "I want to show you something," Gus said, placing the photograph in Ronan's hands. Ronan studied it a long moment. His own younger, unguarded laugh, a version of himself from before he'd let himself imagine loving anyone again. "You kept this," Ronan said quietly, "this whole time." "I kept it because the second I took it, some part of me already knew," Gus said. "Before I knew your name. Before I knew about Callum. Before any of it. I looked at you laughing in a hardware store and thought, there he is, the person I already saved once without knowing it, standing right in front of me, alive and whole and completely unaware of what he meant to me already. I'm not leaving because I want distance from that feeling, Ronan. I'm going because I want to come home to it. I want to spend a year photographing empty places precisely so I understand, finally, what it feels like to have somewhere. Someone worth coming back to. I've never had that before. Not really. Not until you." Ronan's eyes were wet, and he didn't try to hide it, which was itself a kind of progress 3 years in the making. "I built a whole life out of not letting myself need anyone this much," he said. "And here you are, about to fly across the ocean, and I've never needed anyone more." "Then let that be the thing you hold on to," Gus said. "Not the fear of what could go wrong. The certainty of what we've already survived to get here. I found you once in the wreckage of the worst night of your life. I am not going to lose you now, over a year and an ocean, when I have spent 2 extra years already learning exactly how much you're worth crossing distances for." Ronan laughed, wet and disbelieving, the sound breaking something loose in his chest that had been clenched for 6 weeks. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me in a piano workshop. I've had a lot of time to think about what to say. 6 weeks of you avoiding the subject gives a man time to prepare a speech." "I wasn't avoiding it. I was terrified of it." "I know," Gus said gently. "That's why I waited until tonight to say it. I needed you to be ready to hear it, not just brace for it." They stood together at the workshop window as the fog thickened outside, and Ronan found himself, for the first time in 6 weeks, actually breathing easily. "Go to Iceland," he said finally. "Photograph every empty pier and frozen harbor you can find. Build the book you've always wanted. And when you're done, come home to the cliffside workshop I've been too afraid to tell you I'm actually building. Because some part of me has known since the day you told me the truth in this doorway that I wasn't just building it for myself anymore." Gus's whole face changed. "You're building it. I've had the land since March. I didn't tell you because I was scared that if I said it out loud, it would mean admitting how much I'd already let myself hope for a future. With you in it, permanently, not just as a best friend who happens to also be the love of my life. I was scared hope was a debt I couldn't afford to owe twice. You can," Gus said, pulling him close, forehead against forehead the way they had the night the first truth came out. "I promise you, you can. I'll help you build it. Every window, every glass wall looking out at the water. I'll photograph the whole thing coming together, and I'll send you pictures from Iceland so it never feels like I'm as far away as the map says I am, and in a year I will walk back into a finished workshop with your name already carved somewhere into the wood, and I will not be a stranger who saved your life anymore. I'll just be the man who came home to it." He left 6 weeks later on a gray morning, the harbor quiet, gulls circling low over water still pale with the last of the winter fog, and Ronan stood on the dock until the ferry that would carry him to the mainland airport was nothing but a smudge against the horizon. It didn't feel like the accident. It didn't feel like Route 9, or wreckage, or 90 seconds that changed everything without warning. It felt, instead, like the particular ache of choosing someone on purpose. Eyes open, fear acknowledged, love chosen anyway, and Ronan understood, standing there in the cold, that this was the real difference between the man he'd been 3 years ago and the man he was now. He hadn't stopped being afraid of loss. He had simply decided, at last, that love was worth the risk of it. The year that followed wasn't easy, but it was, in its own way, its own kind of romance. Photographs arriving from Reykjavik of frozen harbors that looked, Gus always said, like Thornbay Harbor's colder cousin. Voice messages recorded at odd hours across the time difference, full of half-finished sentences and unguarded laughter. A workshop rising slowly on the cliffside, glass panel by glass panel, built by Ronan's hands and funded, in some part, by Gus's growing reputation as the photographer who found warmth in empty places. When Gus finally came home, almost exactly a year to the day he'd left, the workshop stood finished against the winter light, full of instruments Ronan had spent the year bringing back from the edge of being unfixable, and carved discreetly into the underside of the windowsill, where only someone who knew to look would ever find it, were two words Ronan had added the week the walls went up: worth staying. Gus found them on his first night home, running his fingers over the carved wood while Ronan watched from across the room, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because some truths, once spoken loudly enough the first time, only need to be whispered ever after. They had both, in their own ways, sworn they would never risk this kind of love again. Ronan after the wreckage of a February storm, Gus after a lifetime of photographing places precisely so he'd never have to stay anywhere long enough to lose them. And yet here they were, in a glass-walled workshop on a cliff above Thorn Bay Harbor, proof standing in front of each other that the promises people make in their worst moments are not always the ones fate intends for them to keep. Sometimes the truest way to honor a broken promise is to let someone patient enough, brave enough, and stubborn enough finally teach you how to break it, and to spend the rest of your life grateful that they did. 2 winters had passed since Gus came home from Iceland, and Thorn Bay Harbor had grown used to the sight of them together. Ronan at the cliffside workshop most mornings, glass walls fogged with condensation, hands full of old ivory and brass. Gus in the harbor at dawn with his camera, chasing the particular gray light he still swore existed nowhere else in the world. The workshop had become something of a local landmark. Instruments arriving from towns up and down the coast. People driving hours because they'd heard a man on a cliff above the water could make broken things sing again. Gus's book from that year in Iceland had done well enough that a gallery in the city wanted a second one, this time closer to home, a study of Thorn Bay Harbor itself, the town that had taught him, he liked to say, that staying could be its own kind of adventure. They had built, without either of them quite noticing the architecture of it happening, an ordinary life neither of them had believed they'd get to have. Sunday dinners on the workshop floor had become Sunday dinners at the small house on Candle Street they now shared. Gus's photographs slowly filling the walls Ronan had once kept deliberately bare. Ronan no longer flinched at February. He had, in fact, started keeping a small shelf in the new workshop for the tools that had once belonged to Callum. Not hidden away in a box in a closet, the way he'd kept them for years, but out in the light, a quiet acknowledgement that loving Gus had never required erasing what came before him. Gus had encouraged that shelf into existence himself, understanding something Ronan hadn't fully believed until he watched Gus dust it without flinching. That his own love wasn't in competition with a ghost. It simply existed alongside one, the way the tide exists alongside the shore it will eventually reshape. What Ronan didn't know was that Gus had been carrying a ring in the bottom of his camera bag for 6 weeks, wrapped in a spare lens cloth, waiting for a night he could work up the courage to ask a question that terrified him more than any wreck on Route 9 ever had. It wasn't that he doubted Ronan's love. It was that he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who photographed absence for a living, exactly what he'd be asking Ronan to risk. Ronan had planned a wedding once already, down to the flowers, and lost the man he'd planned it with in a single February storm. Asking him to make that promise again wasn't just a proposal. It was asking him to trust the universe with the same bet twice, and Gus wasn't at all certain he had the right to ask that of anyone, even himself. He'd nearly worked up the nerve 3 times that autumn and lost it each time. Once at the harbor at sunrise, once in the workshop with sawdust still in Ronan's hair, once on the anniversary of the day they'd first met in the hardware store, brass wire still sitting somewhere in a drawer at home as a kind of relic. Each time, the fear won. Not fear that Ronan would say no. Fear that saying yes would cost Ronan something Gus wasn't sure was fair to ask him to spend twice. The letter arrived on an ordinary Thursday in November, addressed in a careful, unfamiliar hand to Callum Ashworth, a name no one had written on an envelope in over 5 years. Ronan stood in the doorway of the house on Candle Street holding it like it might catch fire, the postmark from a city 3 hours south, the return address a name he recognized instantly and hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. Edward Ashworth, Callum's father. He didn't open it that night. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at it the way a man looks at weather rolling in from the sea, and Gus, watching from across the room, understood immediately that whatever question he'd been planning to ask that evening would have to wait. You don't have to open it tonight, Gus said gently, sitting down across from him. I know, Ronan said. I don't know if I want to open it at all. Do you want me to stay while you decide? I always want you to stay, Ronan said, and something in the plainness of it made Gus's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with the letter and everything to do with how far they'd come from a man who once couldn't say those words out loud. Ronan opened it 2 days later at the cliffside workshop, in the particular gray light Gus loved so much, as though he needed the whole of Thornbay Harbor around him to absorb whatever was inside. The letter was short. Edward Ashworth wrote that he was dying. Nothing dramatic, he'd said, just an old man's heart finally slowing down the way old hearts do, and that there was something he'd carried for 5 years he needed to say before it was too late to say it. He wrote that the night of the accident, he had spoken to the police officer who filed the original report, and had learned something he never told Ronan, because he hadn't known how, and because grief had made him a coward in ways he was only now, at the end of his life, ashamed enough to correct. The guardrail on Route 9, he wrote, had been flagged as structurally unsound 11 months before the accident, in a county inspection report that had been filed and then quietly ignored due to a budget dispute that had nothing to do with Ronan or Callum or the storm that night. It had never been Ronan's fault or Callum's or fate's cruelty, or any of the private explanations Ronan had constructed for himself in the years since. It had been an ordinary bureaucratic failure, the kind that happens in small towns everywhere, and Edward Ashworth had known it for 5 years and said nothing, because saying it meant admitting his son might still be alive if anyone, had simply fixed a guardrail on time. I'm sorry, the letter ended. Not only for what happened to Callum, but for the years I let you carry a weight that was never yours to carry, when I had the truth the whole time and was too afraid of my own grief to give it to you. I hope it isn't too late for it to matter. I hope you have found some peace since then, wherever you are. Callum would have wanted that more than anything. Ronan sat with the letter for a long time, the workshop quiet except for the wind against the glass, and when he finally looked up at Gus, his face was wet and open in a way Gus had rarely seen, even after everything they'd survived together. 3 years, Ronan said. 3 years I told myself if I just grabbed the wheel or noticed the ice sooner, or asked him to pull over when the rain got bad. 3 years I built a version of that night where it was somehow a test I'd failed. And it turns out it was never a test at all. It was just an unfixed guardrail and bad luck and a county budget meeting, and nothing I did or didn't do in that car would have changed a single second of it. How does that feel? Gus asked carefully, not wanting to shape the answer for him. Like something's finally allowed to put itself down, Ronan said. I've been carrying a guilt that was never mine for 3 years without even fully knowing I was carrying it. And you, his voice caught. You've been carrying your own guilt about that night for even longer. And neither of us needed to be sorry for surviving something that was never a referendum on either of our worth in the first place. Gus reached across the workbench and took his hand, ordinary and steady, the way he had 100 times before, except this time it felt like the first time either of them had touched without some old weight still hanging between them. Maybe that's what this letter actually gives you, he said. Not just an answer. Permission. To stop measuring your whole life against one storm. Ronan wrote back to Edward Ashworth that same week, a short letter of his own, forgiving a silence he hadn't even fully known he'd been resenting, and 2 weeks later, when word came that Edward had passed peacefully in his sleep, Ronan surprised himself by feeling something closer to grace than grief, the sense of a door finally closing gently instead of being slammed shut by circumstance the way the last one had been. It was on the night after the funeral, the two of them back at the cliffside workshop with the last of the daylight fading gray and gold over the water, that Gus finally understood what he'd been waiting for all along. He hadn't been waiting for the perfect moment, or even for his own fear to fully disappear. He'd been waiting for Ronan to finish putting down a weight that had never belonged to him, so that whatever came next between them could be chosen freely, without an old guilt quietly voting on Ronan's behalf. Watching him now, lighter somehow, sawdust in his hair, humming something unconscious and half-formed as he ran his hand along the keys of a piano that had arrived that week in pieces, Gus understood there would never be a moment more honest than this one. He didn't make a speech. He didn't wait for candlelight or a particular kind of evening. He simply reached into the camera bag sitting by the workshop door, unwrapped the ring from the lens cloth it had lived in for 6 weeks, and set it gently on the piano keys in front of Ronan, the quiet click of metal against ivory enough to make Ronan go still. I've been carrying this for 6 weeks, Gus admitted, trying to find the courage to ask you something, and kept losing my nerve because I was so afraid of asking you to risk this again. I know what a promise like this cost you once. I know I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you anyway, not instead of what came before, not in competition with it, just here in whatever comes next, for as long as you'll let me stay. Ronan looked at the ring, then at Gus, then out at the water where the fog was just beginning its slow evening crawl across the harbor. 3 years and a lifetime removed from the storm that had once convinced him love was too dangerous to risk twice. You pulled me out of a wreck before I even knew your name, he said softly. You spent 2 years too afraid to tell me the truth, and when you finally did, I chose you anyway, because some things are worth the risk of losing all over again. I'm not scared of that risk anymore, Gus. Not with you. Is that a yes? It's the easiest yes I've ever said in my life, Ronan said, laughing through the tears now falling freely, and when Gus slid the ring onto his finger in the fading gray light of the workshop, the two of them wrapped in the particular quiet of a promise finally being kept instead of broken. Ronan understood that he had not, in the end, betrayed the vow he'd made in the wreckage of that February storm. He had only ever misunderstood what the vow was really asking of him. He had sworn he would never love again, and love, patient and unhurried and utterly undeterred, had simply waited on a cliffside above Thorn Bay Harbor until he was ready to learn that keeping a promise to yourself sometimes means being brave enough to finally let it go.